Well, welcome everyone to week 2 in our series, Day by Day. In this season where things seem to change constantly, and many of the expectations that we used to hold so confidently for the future, they're just less certain. We've been facing this truth that we are actually not in charge of tomorrow, that we have less control than we thought, and that things are constantly, and probably for a while at least, will be constantly changing. But in the midst of all this, there's really great news. God has never asked us to control tomorrow. In fact, all he asks for us is to live today well with him and to trust him for tomorrow. So we're learning again how to live day by day, doing what we know today and trusting God with what's ahead. For the rest of our series, we're actually going to do this with the help of a group of people from 3,000 years ago, the Hebrew people, as their story is told in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, we call it. And while there's a lot of differences, we actually have way more in common than we might think. In fact, here's just a few things that were very true of them that feel eerily similar to us. The first one is this: they were taken completely out of the familiar. Everything they had known and generations of their family had known, they left and walked out into brand new. The resources that they carried into it, not knowing how long the journey would be, the resources they carried into it would not be enough to carry them through it. Man, I can resonate with that. They lived a long season in the desert, which I can resonate as well. Not just literally here in Vegas, but there just seems to be this season of desolate, dry, trying to figure out what's next. And they were somewhere, they didn't know where they were in the story. They were somewhere between what was and what would be. They didn't even know where they would find themselves in that, but somewhere, like, are we closer to the beginning? Are we closer to the end? Where are we at in this journey? Where exactly are we heading? Does any of this sound familiar? And by the way, maybe this will sound familiar too. Along the way, we get the sense from the story that they were not particularly happy about how things were currently. This resonates deeply with me as I look around and think about the way that I've been talking with friends, even the experience of me and our family. But there's this other thing that was true in these people, and I think it's at least as true now as ever. And that was this: that God is up to something. That God was up to something in the middle of this. The emotions apparent in the story of this group of people are so familiar to ours. In fact, I sat down with 4 others who had spent some time reading through this story of these people. And I asked them to make 2 lists. The first list was this: what must these people have experienced? Like, how did it feel? What was it like on an average weekday? What were the emotions that captured this journey that these people were on? And then I asked them to make a second list. What are people around us? What have you heard about what people are experiencing and feeling right now? And it was crazy. The lists were basically identical. But here's the thing: because we get to look back at their story, seeing it all the way from beginning to end, we can actually learn a lot about how to live the story we're in right now from the middle. Because the middle's the hard spot, right? Where you've left what's behind, but you're not to where to what's ahead. It's challenging, but it's kind of like this. As I read it, it's like a movie. When you're looking at someone else's story, there are moments to cheer and celebrate and be excited about, right? But there are also moments where you're like almost yelling at the screen because you're like, what are you thinking? Why would you do that? Like, in every horror movie ever, don't go anywhere alone, especially the basement. Like, everyone knows this. Why don't the people know this, right? It's so easy to see from outside the TV. Or in Hamilton, listen, for the love, don't write your way out. That will not end well for you. We can all see this from the outside. Looking from the outside, it seems so easy what the right thing to do is. Like giving people advice or direction. And how many times have you found yourself teaching a child or giving a friend advice and you're like, oh, I know exactly what to do. And by the way, I should probably take my own advice. When it's us and we're in the middle of the story, which is always the hard part, it's harder. So we're gonna look at their story. We're gonna look for what God was up to and how they could have, and maybe from the outside looking in, should have responded. And let's let that inform how we might respond in a season that is very similar. You can check out this whole saga in the books in the Old Testament called Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. I just put them out of order. I have no idea why. But let me give you some highlights of the journey. In fact, grab your phone or take a screenshot of what you're seeing right now. These are some chapters that get right at the narrative of this journey of the people of Israel once they were rescued out of slavery in Egypt up until the moment they enter the land that God had promised to give them. This is just to snap a picture of, you can have a look at it this week. While there are obviously many differences between people 3,000 years ago and us, we have a lot to learn from the people and their journey. So let's just walk through some of those simple statements that sound so familiar. These people were taken out of what was familiar. What began for their family, all of them, as recognition and rescue in Egypt, when a family of 75 made their way there and provided even a rescue for the people of Egypt. Fast forward to where we pick the story up 400 years later, and they've been in slavery and oppressed the whole time. Generation upon generation upon generation, all raised in Egypt, knowing the same thing day in and day out, building and laboring for Pharaoh and his empire. But then God, in the midst of this, having heard the cry of his people, orchestrates an epic rescue with this not so likely leader named Moses and his brother Aaron and sister Miriam to help. God sends 10 plagues, like corresponding to the gods of Egypt, demonstrating that he is the God who is, as opposed to all these other gods that were not. And finally, Pharaoh grew weary and he sent the Hebrew people away. Probably as many as people estimate 2 million people, 2 million Hebrews, the Israelite people, into the desert on their way to a land that God had promised them generations before. We'll pick up their story in the desert, having left the familiar, 400 years of awful but familiar. Them on the edge wondering what this new season would look like. Does that sound familiar? All kinds of known left behind for a mysterious future. The resources that they carried into this would not be enough to carry them through it. Now, God, in a really cool way, orchestrated their escape out of Egypt, and even on the way out, caused the Egyptian people to give them so many resources. But where we pick up the story in Exodus 16, they've totally run out of supplies. They're 1 month into their journey, and they have nothing left. Like the 6-year-old who decides in a fit one day to run away. They were going to need more than the cheese stick and snack pack they grabbed on the way out. It was running out, and they didn't know where in the middle of the desert to find what they needed. And as I think about us, I'm reminded of a phrase that Jim Branch once said to our staff. He says, there comes a moment in our lives and in our leadership when we realize we need more than we brought. The longer this pandemic goes, the more I realize I need new ways of thinking. The more that weaknesses and parts of me that are not the best become more and more of a liability, where greater patience than I've ever needed before is demanded of us, where new rhythms of life, whether it's really sprinting and offering great energy and effort to things, followed by, hopefully, periods of rest and recovery. So many moments through this, I found myself saying, man, I was not prepared for this. Anyone else? Could resonate, I think. Well, listen, for these people, not only those things were true, but it was a long season in the desert. The desert is not exactly a resource-rich environment, and it was hard for these people, 2 million of them traveling in open land. It was hard for them to imagine where food and water, resources that they would literally need, would actually come from. It was challenging. It was hard to see. It was hard to know. There was frustration. There was lack, all kinds of things that they wrestled with along the way. And like us, they were somewhere, who knows where, between what was and what would be. Now, what was awful. We talked about that, right? But what would be, as great as it would be promised, it wasn't in sight yet. They didn't know what that was going to look like. They had a few words. They had the description of a leader named Moses, but they didn't have any real experience of like that. And they couldn't even reach to their ancestors. For 400 years, they'd all been in the same place. And spoiler alert, this journey turns out to be way longer than any of them planned. This desert journey for the Hebrew people was not short. It would be 40 years before they arrived in the land that God had promised. That kind of journey cannot be run through. It is not a sprint. It needs a measured pace. These people lived and would have to live for a long time in the loss of a familiar past and without precise clarity of the future or exactly when that future would arrive. I don't know how long life will need to adjust for this pandemic, but it has already been longer than I thought, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. We are going to need a pace and a rhythm that can be sustained for a long haul. These people as well, they had this truth that we're experiencing that at least it seems like from the news and any social media feed I watch. People were trying to make the best of it, but they were not particularly happy about where things were currently. Now, they had just been rescued from slavery, and they were en route to a promised land of freedom, at different times called a land flowing with milk and honey. It was often described that way, but like any good road trip, the complaints were not far behind. And we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 16, verse 2. It says, there too, referring to a place they were in their journey, there too, as if they had done this before, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. Nobody complains about leaders these days, but back then they did. Verse 3, it says, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you, Moses and Aaron, have brought us into the wilderness to starve us all to death. I'm just like, oh my goodness, that's some kind of hangry. As I read through this story, I'm like, listen, what are you complaining about? God just parted the sea and 2 million people walked through. He crushed an army, the greatest army in the world at the time, behind you. This is too close to real life, where we're rolling down the road with our kids on a road trip and they start to say, I'm hungry, I'm bored. And I'm like, look, I just spent $65 on Chick-fil-A like 20 minutes ago. But I gotta confess, as now one on the journey from a familiar past to an unclear future, I've been doing my fair share of pandemic complaining. And I've heard a fair amount from others. But here's the thing. For all those things we had in common with them, God was up to something then, and God is up to something now. God begins doing things that I don't think anyone would have anticipated in the life of Israel. What he does next in response to their complaints, nobody would have drawn it up this way. Nobody would have said, this is the way it should go. And frankly, it was not something they probably would have preferred, but the things that God does, they always come with a purpose. And I'm gonna read what happened. And I want you to look, not for what is happening or how it's happening, but this. Why is it happening? What is God up to in the events they're experiencing? In verse 4, it says this. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, look, I'm gonna rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they will gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual. Did you catch it? Did you see why he did this? I don't think anybody would have drawn up the plan. Listen, you know what we should do here in the middle of the desert is we'll just wait for stuff to fall out of heaven every single day, but we won't pick up enough for a week. We'll just pick up for each. Nobody would have drawn this plan. But that's not the point. Why? Why did he do this? Watch again as I jump back in verse 6. This is Moses and Aaron talking about it. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, by evening you will realize that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard your complaints, which are against him and not against us. What have we done that you should complain against us? Well, his question didn't land because it didn't stop the people of Israel from complaining against Aaron and Moses. But did you catch it? Did you catch why God was doing this? One more chance, maybe really clear here in verse 12. I've heard, this is God speaking to Moses, I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread that you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. You see, end to beginning, here's what God was up to. He said this, you will know that I am the Lord your God. In what Moses and Aaron said, he said, then you will realize it was the Lord. You see, God was inviting 2 million people to embrace him as their first and primary leader, as their Lord, as their God, which was no small feat because these people, they just knew what they knew. They were used to what they were used to. They had an ethnic identity as Hebrews, and God had done some cool stuff in their ancestors, but it had been a minute, like a long minute in slavery in Egypt. And so that wasn't probably day-to-day thought for them. And even as 2 million people walked out, even as they endured the miraculous rescue, they still weren't used to being God's people. Now God was gonna have to show them who he was and how he would relate to them as their leader. You see, they had a vision of leadership. The Hebrew family structure was part of that. Pharaoh, the Egyptian slave masters, all of those were part of the leadership framework that these people would have had. But God never wanted us, and he never wanted them to settle for anything less than his leadership. For the people of Israel to live through the tumultuous time ahead, to leave behind this identity as slaves and the slavery that they had experienced and find their way into a promised land, and not just a location or a place, but an identity living with God and his people. They were gonna need the leadership of their God, and the same is true for us. If we're gonna thrive, even in a challenging season like this, and not just survive these days, we need our God. We need our God, and we need him first. Long before we need the agreement or our preference from any other leader, organization, movement, business, employer, any of the above, what we need first is our God. This is what God was up to in the midst of this journey. It's why he instituted the plan he did. Bread in the morning, meat in the evening. Bread in the morning, meat in the evening. Day after day after day. He wanted them to know, I'm providing for you. There's no other way to explain this. No other leader will lead and provide for you the way that I will. And so he was trying to teach them, listen, above everything, more than getting to your destination, what you need is me, God is saying. People often want to settle for men or women as their leaders. And certainly God empowers some of his people to lead, just like he did with Miriam and Aaron and Moses, but never in an exchange or in a misordering of his leadership. Now, how is God gonna do that? How does God take people who are used to being led only by other people, so easy to complain against because they fail, they're just people? How do we, as people, really embrace and the reality that we need God? How do we really learn something really well? We learn it by experience. And we learn it day by day. You saw it in the story, right? Right in the middle of God's plan, it's right here. Each day, the people can go out and pick as much food as they need for when? That day. Day by day, God was teaching them, I got this. I've got you. Trust me for today, God is saying. Do what's right today. Just follow my instructions and I will do everything. I've already made a way for you to have everything that you need. He's looking at them and he's saying, listen, you can't experience all that I have for you trying to guess the next step, and you won't really know me. You won't really know what it's like to live with me if you store up so much that you forget to look for me each day. It's bad for you to try to get ahead of me or go without me, he says. In fact, he goes on and he says it this way, I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. Now, listen, don't start picturing God like a math teacher, all right? There's no joy in setting that thing down that you're like, listen, I don't have any idea how to do geometry proofs. It's not the image that we need. Instead, think like a swim test. You know, at our YMCA, there's a swim test. Anytime you go, and they're like every hour or whatever, and you get a wristband. And that wristband lets all the lifeguards and everyone know that you've passed the swim test. And when you've done that, you get to go in the deep end. You get to go off the diving boards and get in trouble for doing flips. You get to go down the slides and try to sneak past the guards at the top and go in pairs. There's so much good just on the other side of the swim test. But the lifeguards don't know if you can be trusted to handle all of that good until you show that you can be trusted with one foundational, necessary piece of the experience: swimming. Similarly, to really experience the life God has for us, daily trust and daily doing the simple things he's asking us are foundational, essential to life with him. And he knew that the Hebrew people would never make it to the promised land, much less enjoy all that he had in mind there and in between for them if they couldn't trust him for today's provision by simple action of obedience. They had seen God do some big stuff, but now God wanted to meet them in the daily, because that's where relationship really happens, in the margins, in the dailiness, not in the heights and the depths, but everything in between. And I begin to wonder if there's a lot of our story in this. Like, many of us have seen God come through in our lives or in the life of a friend or a family member, but we aren't always ready to dial into today, in the dailiness of life, looking to God. Listen, God was up to something then. He was inviting them to follow him daily, every single day, day by day. And God is up to something now. He's inviting us to follow him day by day. Many have learned to look to God only in the big, desperate, panicked, I need a miracle kind of moments. And don't get me wrong, these people had those with God. Or we look in the same old places, situations, and settings, and once we've looked there, we go elsewhere and settle for lesser leaders and all the other stuff, whether political leaders or bosses, movement leaders, or even church leaders. And it's not long before we get caught up in complaining about those leaders around us when we haven't done the foundational thing we do in life with God, looking to him first. Our posture changes. Our tone changes, our attitude changes, our hope changes, our hurt has different places to go when we go to God first. Now, listen, I want to be delicate, but I want to be really direct too. Our complaining and distrust at times and our eagerness to settle for too little in leadership, just like the Israelites, it actually reveals our limited trust in God. Moses said as much to the people. He said, your complaints aren't against us. They're against God. I wonder if we need to back up and ask if that's more true of us than we would like to admit. God has so much in mind for us, but the only way forward is really simple. Daily obedience with him as our first leader. Not a political leader, not a movement leader, not a business leader, not our employer, not a church leader. I wonder if those of us who are listening to this and looking so easily at the people of Israel, like, why didn't they just trust God first? Why didn't they look past their situation? Why couldn't they see the bigger picture? I wonder if some of us would be bold enough to ask this question. How much have I been looking to worldly leaders for what only God can provide? How much have I been looking to other leaders for what only God can provide? Now, I get it. Worldly leaders have an impact on our lives. They have say. They get to determine some degree of comfort with what is open or not, what's open to us, what opportunities exist, and those kind of things. I get all of that. But when we go to God first, it changes our perspective. What we really need is found in his leadership. And this is what he was teaching the Israelites day by day by day. And I think this might be what God is up to in teaching us right now. Look to me first. Look to me first. Look to me first. Before you go anywhere else, look to me first. Where have we been holding unreasonable expectations of others? It's kind of hard to know because I think most of us, especially those of us who have said we want to point our life in God's direction, we would say quickly, yeah, I trust God first. Yes, that's what I do. But maybe there's a few places right out of this story that would reveal some good questions for us to ask, like this. What have we been complaining about? What does that reveal about where our trust really is? Who have we been complaining to? You know, there's a part in the story, you caught it if you paid close attention or if you read it again later this week. God said, I don't know if I read it actually or not. God said, don't store up food. Trust me for each day, right? But some tried it, of course, because there's always those people. But the next day, what they found is the food they tried to store was full of maggots and odor. Gross, right? But God was not willing for it to last another day because that's just a symbol of distrust. So maybe just ask this question. What have you tried to hold on to for too long and it's turned bad? Or God said, this is good for now, but it's not good forever, but you've tried to hold on and it's turned bad. Or we'll say more about this next week. Others actually failed to do something else God said. On the seventh day, God wanted them to rest. And so what people did, some of them didn't listen to him, and they went looking to find food where there wasn't any. And I wonder if that's a question we should ask. Where have we been looking? Maybe over and over and over for clarity, for confidence, for satisfaction, for answers, for preference, and not finding what we're looking for. If our first answer isn't God, it's revealing. And listen, be gentle with yourself. Let's be gentle with ourselves. We're human just like the people in these stories. We get things wrong all the time, but let's invite God to be really honest and help us see, like, where in our lives we're not actually trusting him, because trust in God is not something that's like an on or off switch. It's something that grows. It's not like you have it or you don't. It's more like how much do you have? So if you're starting from scratch and you never trusted God with anything, the smallest step in his direction is a great experiment. And for all of us, some of us who've been following for a very long time, there is always more ground to cover. And here's what we've been finding, is that the more we trust God for real, like actively trust God to be our leader daily, each day, for that day, trusting that God has us today and he'll have us tomorrow, the more our life becomes, like Jesus said, rich and satisfying. Let me give you a really simple practice to try to step into that this week. I heard a guy say this one time. He reduced his prayer life down to 2 words, which I would encourage you to spend more time with God than a couple words. But if a couple words is what you can manage, start here, or just add them to what you're already doing. He said the thing he did is when he got up in the morning, the very first thing that he did is he just gave his attention to God and he said, whatever. Whatever you have in mind today, whatever comes up today, whatever it is you would desire, God, I'll go with you. Just whatever. As an expression of trust that he would walk through whatever this day holds. And then in the evening, as he would go to bed, he prayed this other simple prayer. Enough. As an expression of trust that it wasn't his job to try to hold the world together or produce anything for the rest of the night. Instead, it was his job to sleep, and God could be trusted. Beginning each day with whatever, and beginning each evening with enough. And in between, trusting God for that day, knowing that tomorrow he'll have us again. Listen, we need our God. If we're really gonna live day to day, if we're gonna live in the tumultuous times that we're in, if we're gonna live between here and there, having run out of many of the resources that we carried into this thing emotionally and all other kinds of avenues, if we're really gonna live well in that, then we need a leader, and that leader is God. Now, here's the crux of the thing. Any leader that we follow needs to be trustworthy, right? We constantly ask questions about the character of our leaders because we want to know if we can trust them. Before we give them authority, before we entrust ourselves to them, we want to know they have the kind of character that will lead to great leadership. Now, we've said a lot about God's character here, and we have to say a great deal more in coming weeks. In fact, maybe that's really the theme of this whole series. But the best way for you to discover it is to look through this story with some friends or some neighbors. We'll have the scripture up on our website as usual. But as you look, let's just begin this week quickly pointing at maybe the biggest statement we made today about God's character. When people needed God, he showed up. He showed up with Moses and inviting him into leadership. He said, I've heard the cries of my people. He carried Moses and Aaron into Egypt and through 10 plagues and leading 2 million people out into the desert. And when Pharaoh was tracking them down and had their backs against the Red Sea, God showed up and carried them to the other side. When they got thirsty 3 days later into the desert, God provided water. When they started whining about food because they were legit hungry, God said, I will feed you every single day. And over and over and over, as you read through this saga, God shows up because God is a God who shows up when people call out to him. And the same is true today. Like this day. the one that we're in right now. I don't know what happened in all the days before, but this day is a day where God will show up if you will call out to him. And then tomorrow, he will show up if you call out to him. And the day after that, he will show up when you call out to him. God is a God who shows up. We know, because God showed up in all of our mess. When we were at our worst, when we were broken, lost, separated from him, God himself entered creation as Jesus Christ and orchestrated a rescue that is the only one that could supersede this one in the Exodus that we're talking about. In fact, this whole story that we're talking about in the Old Testament only points to the rescue that Jesus orchestrated for all of us. You see, we get to live every single day, not just with a leader who spends time in God's presence like Moses, but each of us in God's presence, because Jesus made a way for every single one of us so the Spirit could set up camp in our lives and reshape us and make us and form us into the kind of people who can live with God day by day by day. No matter how challenging that day is, no matter how unclear the future is, no matter how tired we are from the past, he meets us today. He shows up and leads us today, all because of Jesus. And we remember that in our church in a practice called communion, with a small bite of bread or anything like it that you have available in your home, or a small drink of juice or something like it that you have available in your home, remembering that Jesus gave his body and he gave his blood to pay for anything that would separate us from God. And then he conquered death. Just like the Israelites who should have died in the middle of the Red Sea walked right up and out, we, under Jesus' leadership, walk into brand new life, living every single day, trusting God for this day. So as you take communion, as you remember the sacrifice of Jesus, let's commit to living every single day, even in days like these, with him. Let's take communion.